Welcome to a very special two-part milestone of the Indian App Geek. My name is Vishal Mehra. Today marks our 65th episode, and to celebrate, we are not just bringing you an interview, we are hosting two icons of global aviation strategy. If you follow the hard data of this industry, our first guest needs no introduction. Thomas Jaeger, the founder and CEO of ch-aviation, sits atop what is arguably the world's most comprehensive and accurate intelligence platform for fleet data and operator news. When an aircraft moves anywhere in the world, Thomas knows about it before the ink is dry on the lease. Joining him is a man who has spent decades decoding the why behind the what. Addison Schonland, founder and partner of AirInsight Group, is one of the industry's most respected strategic analysts. From the complexities of engine economics to the shifting sands of OEM market share, Addison's foresight has guided some of the biggest players in the aerospace world. What makes today truly special is the rare convergence of these two minds. It has been nearly 5 years since Thomas and Addison last shared a microphone to dissect the state of the skies. In that time, the world has moved on from a post-pandemic recovery into a high-stakes era of engine crisis, record-breaking orders, and a total reconfiguration of the Indian market. Gentlemen, it's an absolute honor to have you both on the show. Welcome to the Indian App Geek.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with you, Thomas. I want to talk to you about probably the biggest news in global aviation right now of Willie Walsh joining IndiGo. Tell me, what do you think?
Yeah, obviously came as a surprise, and I think it's remarkable how fast they kind of pulled that very prominent rabbit out of the hat, because it's only been 3 weeks since it was announced that Peter was stepping down, and then they announced the most prominent CEO pick that you could possibly announce in such a short period of time. And I mean, it's interesting in both directions. One is that this is probably the most interesting airline CEO job that would be available worldwide, because it's a very fast growing, dynamic carrier here. There is definitely going to be a top 20 airline for decades to come. And at the same time, obviously, Willie Walsh is the best known, most well-connected CEO they could have probably picked, having been the Director General of IATA for quite some time. It's interesting on many levels. I mean, it's also interesting from the perspective that so far the general wisdom was that you become IATA Director General at the end of your career, and you're going to you have a great career at one of the big airline groups, and then the pinnacle kind of is that you become IATA Director General and lead the entire industry as a group thereafter. And so that was surprising from that perspective as well, that obviously Willie jumped at this and decided to have it another go. So definitely a very, very interesting choice, but I mean, it's probably a pretty good choice for IndiGo.
Yeah. Willie Walsh is, of course, widely known as the architect of the IAG model. You know, you have British Airways at the top, you have Vueling right at the bottom in terms of being an LCC in the value spectrum. You look at IndiGo, they've had a very singular focus for the past 19 years. Of course, in the last couple of years, they've started the loyalty program. They now have a stretch product. The 350 widebodies are coming up. The 321 XLRs are already flying. All of these under Peter's leadership. Now Peter is gone. Willie Walsh is coming in. What do you think his mandate will be?
When Peter came in, it was very clear, and it was very publicly discussed that the mandate was going to be to internationalize IndiGo. And I mean, IndiGo had international operations before, flying to the Gulf, flying to ASEAN and so on, but not really on that massive scale that they want to grow now. And nothing has been that publicly said about Willie's mandate. I mean, there was an announcement some weeks ago after Peter left that Alok Singh, who used to be the CEO of Air India Express, would come in to head strategy for IndiGo. And Willie is going to come now in August. And then there is essentially, I guess, two potential outcomes. One is that the strategy is going to stay as is, and it's just going to get executed under new leadership. And I mean, if the strategic decision would have been something outlandishly different, and it would have been go back to LCC roots, then probably Willie Walsh would not have been the most logical pick for this anyway. It's either going to be an execution of the current strategy, or the two of them are going to be mandated to work out what the new strategy is going to be. Now you've mentioned IAG, and obviously IAG is something that Willie Walsh was instrumental in building up. And yes, that included a low-cost carrier. And I mean, since then, British Airways also kind of developed an own low-cost carrier operation within itself by having BA Euroflyer in London Gatwick. And there is a lot there being done through brand differentiation, but Willie Walsh comes from Aer Lingus, and that's where he was before he became the CEO of British Airways. And Aer Lingus, in a sense, went the other way. So he started from being a traditional state-owned carrier that operated like every other state-owned carrier did it back in the old days. And then both market pressure and a lot of that market pressure, obviously being Ryanair in front of its doorstep in Dublin, kind of made it pivot more towards a low-cost carrier short haul, and staying more traditional in its traditional long-haul market towards North America. So in a sense, where Aer Lingus ended up is probably a bit where IndiGo would like to be. So you could obviously say them picking Willie is that they want to continue that existing strategy that they have, internationalize and let everything run as a single operation, where domestically IndiGo operates very differently than they operate internationally. Say one of his expertises is going to be to have a multi-brand, multi-carrier operation, and maybe they want to develop the group into something like that. That's still something that is going to be very difficult to pull off, no matter if you do it as a single operator or if you're trying to build up a group of multiple carriers serving different roles within whatever it's going to be, would be called IndiGo Aviation Group or whatever, IAG.
That's a good one, Thomas. We saw the chaos at the end of last year when IndiGo faced operational disruptions due to staffing and scheduling failures in a market where two players still own about 90% of the slots. Does a hiccup at one airline become a national infra crisis? Is India's aviation ecosystem now too big to fail, but too concentrated to be resilient also at the same time?
And yes, it becomes a problem because you rely on air transportation in a lot of markets, and as we saw when that happened, there was a spillover effect then into ground transportation, which couldn't take the additional demand and volume either. So essentially, there was no option left. But it's not like India is very particular in that sense. I mean, there's a lot of other big markets that have very similar duopoly situations, or maybe sometimes there is three players. I mean, if you just look start somewhere south of the equator. I mean, in Australia, its situation is not much different. It's a duopoly and has been for a long time. In Brazil, you have three players essentially that are relevant. So I mean, there's a lot of other big markets that have a very high dependency on very few carriers. And if you go to four carriers or so, then you have a lot more markets where there is really only four vendors. So there is always when Southwest had their big operational meltdown, that also had a massive impact on the US transportation system, and it was over a holiday period as well. So there is not much, if you're running at the high load factors that we're running as an industry, one single carrier having an operational meltdown is always going to create a problem, no matter if it's a duopoly or if there is multiple carriers involved.
Addison, in the last couple of years, predatory pricing has become an actual concern in the Indian market, especially with the exit, the shutting down, and consolidation of airlines. The Indian regulator, DGCA, and the Competition Council of India as well, makes one wonder if they are equipped to handle a duopoly, or will we see a repeat of the US market where fortress hubs literally allow legacy carriers to keep fares artificially high for decades? Are we entering that phase? Even just a couple of days back, there was a circular out by the DGCA on free allocation of seats, which has now been rolled back.
Yeah, but just before I get to that subject, I want to add to some of the thoughts Thomas has shared, which are exactly on target. One of the things that's interesting about the Southwest case and in the US, when you have industry load factors, now obviously we don't have a duopoly. We have basically four big carriers, but still, given the size and the maturity of the market, they act as a club, if you like, and which I'll get to predatory pricing. The interesting thing is that with the Southwest situation, when you've got 75, 80% load factors, and you have this meltdown, there's nowhere for the traffic to go. It takes 3 days, is the estimate, for the airlines to clear that traffic and move it. It took Southwest probably 10 days to get their program and their systems, their network back to some kind of a rhythm. So when you have such consolidation, it becomes a huge problem. So let's talk about your predatory pricing thing. So obviously when you have a duopoly, the first thing that you learn in game theory about a duopoly is you don't compete on price. Now, give an example. Southwest Airlines bought AirTran, which was based out of Atlanta, and AirTran competed with Delta. You don't compete with Delta, you try and exist. Delta is just too powerful. Atlanta is the most busy airport in the world. You don't mess with Delta. They will destroy you. So what you try and do is stay under the radar. So Southwest comes along, by far the biggest US domestic airline. And what did they do? They came into this fortress hub. And the first thing everybody thought was Southwest is going to come in with their way of doing business, and they're going to cut prices out of Atlanta, and this is going to hurt Delta. No, that's not rational. What did Southwest do? We will take Delta's pricing as the way to do business out of Atlanta. The traffic didn't go away. Demand didn't change, but everybody's now making money. Delta doesn't get irritated, continues to do what they want to do. Southwest does what they were doing with just more, obviously, bigger planes, more capacity, more everything, but not fighting with Delta. And predatory pricing only hurts one person, the person whose credit card is bouncing off the payment. So it is a big issue. Now you mentioned the exit of Go First. Well, firstly, pardon the play on the word first there. Go First, I don't think was a particularly viable business. They had that big fight with Pratt & Whitney where they blamed Pratt & Whitney for everything. Turns out they only made one payment. They didn't pay Pratt & Whitney for parts. That's why Pratt & Whitney stopped supporting them. You don't hear much about that. And when they came to the US court, the case quickly and quietly disappeared. So consolidation is a big thing. The Vistara Air India situation is fascinating. What Air India should have done was try and move towards a successful Vistara product offering. They didn't. They eviscerated and they went down market, but down to Air India's levels, and we'll see that that's not taken them in a particularly good place. The DGCA has covered itself in all kinds of misfortune, firstly with the Air India crash and the investigation, and the really poor way it's handled that, and the way it's handled the IndiGo situation. The fine is a bit of a joke if you consider how much of a spank was that for IndiGo's meltdown. So predatory pricing is not something that just lives by itself. It lives within a system, and predatory pricing is really not driven by the government it's driven by the market. And I think most people would say that Indian airfare prices are probably too low anyway. So that's a long winding response to your short question.
That's all right. Though I must say that the Air India brand name was retained due to its global prominence as a flag carrier, and Vistara was quite limited in its awareness comparatively. On the product front, Air India did take the premium economy product from Vistara. It never had that before. Thomas, coming back to you, in spite of all the geopolitical disturbances, airports are packed. Of course, what's going on in US is something completely different, but airline revenues are crossing the $1 trillion mark this year for the very first time. Yet, the financial foundation feels like it's made of glass. Why does it feel like the industry is holding its breath rather than, celebrating? Of course, we are well aware of what's going on in the Middle East and how that has affected airlines across the world.
Well, I mean, the executives everywhere around the world are less confident now than they were a year ago about what's in it for the industry going forward. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that they have been spoiled post-COVID. So COVID was a traumatic event for the industry, but then it was followed by a period of really high demand, significant increase in premium demand, an artificial constraint on the supply side, creating less supply than would have been required to satisfy that demand in the market. And that was pretty much the case everywhere across the world. So whoever hasn't made record profits the last couple of years probably shouldn't be in the business of running an airline, because it was the easiest time ever to operate. I mean, obviously not easy, because there were a lot of challenges, all of the supply chain issues, aircraft being delivered late, engines not being as reliable as they should have been. But it was a great environment if you looked at the demand versus supply in that period. And what's changing now is that the demand isn't as great anymore as it used to be. So you hear everyone across the world speaking about softness of demand, yields starting to go down, and so on. So I don't think there's a single event that has caused that, and I don't think that everything is down to geopolitical issues caused by the Trump government or anything like that. I think it's just a combination of the economic development in various countries, the fact that there is less of a supply issue than there was before, and so we are now in a situation where that extraordinary period after COVID, where there was a massive amount of demand and all as much supply, has come to an end. And generally speaking, the airline industry has never been very disciplined with capacity. There has always been capacity indiscipline in most markets. As a result of that, there were always irrational players that dragged the markets down, and then that created this volatility. And I mean, it's always been very small margin businesses for the most part. Different in countries where there is a lot of consolidation. So in the US, you obviously have much higher margins, but you also have to understand that if US airlines wouldn't have all of their ancillary revenue coming from credit cards and this and that and whatever, it would still be a razor thin margin business. So
Yeah, and that revenue from credit cards is certainly under threat because of
yes.
what Mr. Donald Trump has been talking about. Let's see what comes out of that. Addison, do you think the duopoly creates a systemic risk which actually discourages foreign investment in the sector? You know, if we go back some years, a decade or so, a decade and a half, Etihad had invested in Jet. I'm sure you'd remember. And after that, there has been, multiple times there has been conversation around Qatar trying to invest in IndiGo. Of course, IndiGo way more successful. They don't need, Middle East money like Jet Airways did. There was conversation around Qatar investing in SpiceJet also. That hasn't happened. A duopoly, does that risk foreign investment in the sector?
No, I don't think a duopoly and foreign investment are two things that should conflate at all. A duopoly is what it is inside of a market, and the issue of opening that market to foreign investors is a state choice. Most states will not allow foreign investment of more than 25%. For example, Qatar recently invested in Airlink in South Africa. They took a stake. Airlink wanted the money because the founder was going to retire. His daughter is a pilot at the airline, and she's not interested in doing anything more than that. So it's a great way to exit, but it's also good way to, if you're a small company like Airlink competing with a national carrier, it's a great way to build a financial cushion on which to do things like, in this case, build an E2 fleet. So I don't think a duopoly and in foreign investment is two things that I would kind of put in the same category. The big thing here is my view, that we see too many countries who feel that a flag carrier is something that's important. I think increasingly, particularly you see this in Africa, and the truth is you could say the same thing about the ME3, the Middle East 3, Qatar, Emirates, and what was the other one?
Etihad. Yeah.
If you go back 15, 20 years, no one ever heard of those countries. Never. Suddenly that their flag was on the tail of an airplane and the airlines grew all over the world. Now everybody knows where they are. So there's a case of a national carrier doing something. But again, duopoly and foreign investment is something that I don't know that I would sort of put that cocktail together. Countries don't need to own airlines. It's ridiculous. And they should. And I think that if you're going to be, this is the American in me, I suppose, open the market. Let the winners win and let the losers lose, and don't irritate the taxpayer. Why should the taxpayer, living in India, Vishal, you would know what the taxpayer put into Air India? Billions. For what?
For years non-stop. All that money could have gone to education, to healthcare, to whatnot.
And so
but now it's in thin air.
Right. So the question you need to ask yourself there, where did a duopoly fit in there? It didn't fit in all. It wasn't an issue. The fact is, whenever you get states getting involved, all they happen to do is their return on investment and their investment decisions are not based on economics. They're based on something else. Public policy, particularly politicians getting upgrades. I mean, bottom line. So, that's my long-winded answer. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think it's also driven, I mean, in a sense, the Indian government's policies have led to this duopoly situation, because duopoly was created by an Indian government decision to divest of Air India by choosing the partner they were going to go with, which happened to be a competitor of Air India, by having rules and regulations for many years that restricted new carriers from being allowed to fly abroad, by having very strict traffic right allocations and giving them to the established players and so on. So I mean, the Indian government created the duopoly themselves with the policies and procedures that they had for how to create a playing field for Indian carriers. So in a sense, had the Indian government not wanted a duopoly, they could have prevented that from happening.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean that's we can have a whole podcast on the Indian government and the policies and the steps they have taken in the past, different administrations. But yeah, fair point, Thomas. Guys, I want to talk about the death of the pure LCC model in some ways. Especially in the Indian market, you see Air India's LCC brand, which is Air India Express, going slightly up market. They have they have ovens and slightly better seating and whatnot to sell now. Same for IndiGo. They have a premium product now. It's called IndiGo Stretch, similar to the US first class. It's a recliner seat. I can see Addison stretching there with his dumbbells. Absolutely. Thomas, do you think an airline can truly be an LCC if its fleet configuration is no longer uniform? I mean, Southwest also has an extra legroom seat, but still the fleet configuration is very similar. But in India, we see a different model emerging with Air India Express and IndiGo, like I mentioned. What's your take?
You mentioned many different carriers. I mean, I think Southwest, even before they now started to differentiate different seats and so on, wasn't a true ultra low cost carrier by the book, even though they probably invented the low cost carrier business model, because they never really had the maximum number of seats on aircraft that you could have put on aircraft, even before the configuration changes that they started making now to be able to differentiate for premium seating and so on. I think in general the question always is how much can you scale that ULCC model and stay true to it. And I think if you can scale it and if you stay true to it, it works very well. I mean, you see many carriers around the world that are very successful in the ULCC model. Obviously, being a European myself, there is a Ryanair, there is Wizz Air. You have many carriers around the world that are very successful with that business model. Look at Volaris in Mexico, for example, or even as a subsidiary of a major airline, look at Jetstar in Australia. But I think what we have seen time and time again, and that's what's happening in India as well now, is that as these carriers grow, they start to have ambitions that go beyond the original business model. And then they start to evolve from a ULCC business model into some sort of a hybrid business model. What we will have to see is if IndiGo is going to be the first carrier that is actually able to pull that off, because everyone else that tried that before, in my opinion, didn't really manage to be better off than if they would have been sticking to what they originally did. I mean, you have WestJet in Canada that went through that transformation. You have Virgin Australia that went through that transformation. Funnily enough, both of them at some point later figured out, oh, we should set up a low-cost carrier again or a ULCC again, and set one up, and then that failed because it was then a ULCC subsidiary of a hybrid carrier with Tiger Air Australia and Swoop. So IndiGo will be the first ULCC that manages to successfully transform itself into a hybrid carrier. And I'm not sure if the challenge of turning Air India from what we discussed before, a very heavily loss-making national carrier, into now what is supposed to be the exact opposite, or if it's more challenging to turn IndiGo from a ULCC into a global mega carrier, which is what they would like to be once they have all of these A350s delivered. Both of these are pretty extreme changes of directions, and they're happening at the same time. And I don't think we've ever seen a situation where, as you said before, 90% of the capacity was provided by carriers going through massive transformations at the same time. So it's a very unique situation that we see in the Indian market there.
Addison, in the US, legacy carriers used basic economy to successfully suffocate ULCCs like Spirit, which is in a heap of trouble right now. In India, with Air India's massive wide-body expansion and IndiGo's, if you can call it the new business class or the new premium seating class with stretch, are we entering an era where the product no longer defines the airline, but the network does? I'm also reminded of what Vasu Raja, the ex-COO of American, once said. He said the network is the product, essentially saying the schedule and network are the primary product, not the onboard experience. Admittedly, Vasu Raja's words were have not aged well, but what do you think?
On the one hand, you've got an industry that is constantly trying, how to think about this? It's a brutal business. Like Thomas rightly pointed out at the beginning of the call, margins are razor thin if they exist at all. And then you have this crazy stuff like credit cards on the side to get a more reliable stream of income. So because it's such a high capital business and you've got skilled people working in the industry, you cannot have any kind of mechanic. You cannot have any kind of truck driver. Everybody has to be top of the game. And you're also in an industry that has a safety margin of nothing less than 100%. Right? So it's the 5 nines. Everything has to be the top of the game. So it's high capital, high demand, high skilled, everything is at the top. And you've got this tight margin. So if you're running an airline, and you don't have to be the CEO, you have to be anywhere in the top 5% of the management, you don't sleep at night because everything is so edgy. Give an example. Right now we have this huge storm in the US. Tens of thousands of flights are getting canceled today. How do you plan for this? Well, you knew the weather was coming, but you still don't know. So it's a brutal business. So now, as you put the question, if you're in this industry, you're constantly trying to find a way to de-risk. Everything is de-risk. Now, what's weird is they don't de-risk where they should, which is like using technology, because the standard. Give an example for this. If you look at the on-time performance in the US, the industry average is like $110 a minute. That's the cost. Every flight that arrives late, it's $110 a minute. Now, what happens if you arrive 10 minutes late? Which is not a bad, that happens, right? The FAA says 15 minutes is the margin. That within 15 minutes, you're on time, which is ridiculous. What other industry in the world says that you can perform that way and be okay? Whatever. So let's put that aside. If you arrive 10 minutes late, times $100 a minute, that's $1,000. That's equivalent to probably 3 passengers that you've just carried for free. Now, if you look at the big three, American, Delta, and United, and you look at their cost structures, they could each be buying a new MAX. I think it's 3 MAXes every 6 months, cash. That's it. Every 6 months, they could be buying a new 737 MAX 8 cash, not financing. You got the money just from tightening up your operation. They say they can't make it any better because the dog ate my homework. Any airline person listening to this will probably be very insulted. I mean no personal insults, but the bottom line is it's a messy business and it's high risk. It's awful. So they're always looking for an angle. So where am I going with this? So when you try and see, well, I'm a full service carrier, I'm a ULCC, but I've got a thing here and I've got an angle there and I'm going to try something else. They all do this all the time. And most of the time it fails because you've got a culture that says, I'm Air India and this is how I think. Okay, I'm going to start this thing called India Express on the side. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Delta had a thing called SONG. United had a thing called TED. They don't work because you've been trained to think inside the silo. Now you can say, I'm going to open a valve on the side of the silo and I'm going to have this little side hustle over here. You've got cultural problems. You've got network problems. You've got everything is just crazy. Stop it. There's so much inside the silo that needs to be fixed. Don't think you can go out the silo and make it work. Problem that IndiGo is going to have. They are an LCC, right? They're not known for service. They're known for, I'm going to get you from here to there, cost effective, end of story. Now, I did a story about this, comparing them flying to Athens with their XLR. You look at the seating on that airplane and you look at the Aegean seating on the same plane on the same route. If you are a passenger that can choose where you're going to spend your money, you're not going to fly on IndiGo. You must be crazy. The person who's chasing the lowest cost ticket will fly on IndiGo and they'll just suck it up and deal with it. But if you are a person that can say, well, wait a second, I'm prepared to pay a little bit more. I'm going to get more seat space. I'm going to get more of everything. Other thing that people don't want to talk about too much on the XLR, when I say other people, the people that are flying the XLR and of course Airbus, at the back of the plane, you've got a conflict with the toilets and the kitchen. And you have a single aisle. There's a traffic problem. If you're going to the toilet, you're in the way of the kitchen. If you're coming out of the kitchen to serve people, you're going to get stuck with people standing in line for the toilet. Why is that a problem? What do you think happens on an 8-hour flight? People have to get fed. People need to go to the bathroom. You don't want to have conflict with space. There is no space at the back of the XLR. Oh, you're going to tell me, well, the people at the back of the plane don't really matter that much because they're on the cheap seats. Well, maybe that's one approach, but it's not really a polite approach. It's certainly not service-oriented. IndiGo is going to run into a problem because now you can say they've been flying long hauls, wide bodies. Okay, we'll see how that works. I'm not so sure that it's going to be so easy. I think they're going to have to also figure out a way to have a different side hustle. There's our long haul product, which is going to be it's going to be upgraded compared to our local domestic product, which is whatever it is. So
yeah. Addison, I can tell you with the great degree of certainty that the product on the A350 would certainly will not be the product that is on XLR. And that has been hinted by the IndiGo management as well. In fact, I was on the XLR, the IndiGo's XLR, about 3-4 days back. I can tell you that the seating is slightly more cushioned than the usual IndiGo seat. There is certainly much more legroom. It's a slightly more comfortable experience than the usual IndiGo domestic product. But yeah, I mean, there are certain valid points that you have raised. But I want to ask you on that. Let's say if you were starting an airline today, Addison, would you even bother with the low cost labor, or is that term now a liability in your opinion?
I once watched Richard Branson make a speech. So Richard Branson from Virgin Atlantic. And he said, I am a millionaire in the airline business. Ask me how I became a millionaire in the airline business. I started off with being a billionaire. Smart money doesn't go into the airline business. If you're asking me to start an airline, I'll tell you quite simply, heck no. It's much easier to sit on the sidelines and watch this. It's like watching a prize fight, two big prize fighters fighting with each other. Thank you very much. They should fight. I can sit in the audience and watch. It's crazy. It's high risk. It's high stakes. I wouldn't start an airline. If I had the money, forget about it.
I had an interesting conversation on that topic with I'm not going to name names, but with a former chief commercial officer of an ultra low cost carrier, and I don't know exactly how it went, but it went similar to if someone would put a gun to your head and you had to start an airline, where would you start it and what would it be? And I think that if you go back 10 years ago, there would have been very obvious answers because there were still dots on the map where you could say in this part of the world, no one came up with the ULCC model yet, and there is deregulation. So now you set something up and there is an obvious niche. But if you ask today, I mean, in every country where there's a big enough market that the ULCC model would make sense, there is an incumbent already that is relatively strong. So why, I mean, if you come in as player number 2 or 3, it's too late. So as Addison said, it's super difficult to set up a new airline and make it work. And there is not that, if you look back the last couple of years, after IndiGo, which obviously has been the biggest success story of the last 20 years, there really haven't been a whole lot of low-cost carriers or anything else that has grown from nowhere to that scale in a reasonable time frame. So that
Maybe
shows
Wiz,
that, I
maybe
mean,
Wiz Thomas.
yeah, but Wizz Air has been around longer than IndiGo, and but it's the same story there. Wizz Air brought the ultra low cost carrier model to Eastern Europe. Anyone else that started low cost carriers in Eastern Europe after that has either gone out of business or has scaled to 12 airplanes, and that was about it. So it's not like there is a white dot on the map where you would say, okay, here is the obvious gap where you can set up something fresh and it can scale to 200 airplanes fast. I think that
Thomas,
ship has sailed.
Thomas, it's interesting what you're saying, because as further evidence to support what you're saying, in Iceland, we had WOW, and that didn't go anywhere. Then we had Play, and then suddenly it wasn't Play anymore. And now in the US, we've got Avilo. That it's fascinating, Vishal. This industry has an ability to attract visionaries, and the visionaries can find money. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. That's why it's the best to sit and watch. Don't put your money in, just sit and watch.
I mean, you have bright people like David Neilman, and he just started Breeze, what, 3 years back? So let's move on to the next topic. I want to talk about the A321XLR that Addison was just referring to. From a lessor's perspective, is the XLR a safe asset compared to a 787-8 or a A330neo? If a long-haul P2P route fails, I'm just wondering how easy it is for an airline to re-roll the XLR back into the domestic regional high cycle operations without destroying its economics. If you look at Qantas, all those XLRs are scheduled for domestic operations.
Well, I don't think that is I mean, we have seen some carriers doing that. I mean, Wizz Air, for example, started flying some of their XLRs on different routes and they wanted to, or park them and take the engines off because they changed their business model a little bit. But I mean, they now applied for rights to fly to the US, which is something that they have been thinking about all along when they got these XLRs to fly to the US from the UK. So they might go back to their original purpose with these airplanes. But the way lessors look at an aircraft variant and decide whether or not it is risky or not, essentially it comes down to is there going to be a market to remarket the airplanes in case they come off the first lease, in case the lease goes wrong. And I think the answer is it doesn't seem terribly risky because you have a vast number of different airlines that ordered the aircraft and that believe in it. So that's why I don't think it's risky.
Okay. Addison, you have described the A321XLR as a niche finding its limits. If the aircraft is relegated to niche status, does that mean the death of the hub and spoke was an over-exaggerated prophecy? Or is the niche simply the strike that bleeds the profitability of major hubs?
I love being able to follow the smart comment from Thomas. One of the things that Wizz Air is interested in doing here is connecting to the US. It's because Wizz Air has the same owner as Frontier, IndiGo Partners. So it's natural for them to want to connect. And the same reason they want to connect with their fellow airline in South America. So that, you know, they'll find a way, and they're all buying. I don't know if you saw one of the Wizz Air planes end up going to JetSmart in Chile, which is part of the family, so to speak. In fact, the plane left Europe with Wizz Air colors, but saying Jet Smart on the side. So, on the one hand, there's a thread over there. The second thing is we're living in a time now where you cannot get an airplane fast enough. All these big orders are now people like getting into the line. It's FOMO, fear of missing out. Everybody's, Boeing's not going to do anything new. Although the rumor mill last week again was that the NMA is back on, that team is being reassembled because Boeing is getting their mojo back, or has got their mojo back. The thing about this industry that's fascinating, Vishal, is we can ask the same question once a month, and the answer is going to change every time. Because when we look at this industry, we have a conversation, it's a snapshot, and then things change. So because there is a constant demand for airplanes that seems to be inexhaustible, and at the very tip of the spear of that demand is the 321. Everybody wants a 321. So even if the 321 XLR doesn't quite fit for everybody, they'll find a home. Give an example, the Virgin America 321s. Alaska got rid of them. Which ones did they get rid of? The 321 was the first one. American bought them all. Why? Didn't matter that they were secondhand. They couldn't get them fast enough from new anyway. You need that capacity. The middle of the market airplane, which is one of my favorite subjects in the whole world, is just hot, hot, hot. You see United going from 787-9 to -10s. Why? There's a limit of pilots. There's a limit of slots. The traffic keeps growing. It's physics. You have to get a bigger plane. In the US, we've got pilot issues because they just don't make as many as they need. The industry doesn't generate enough pilots. It's physics. New York airports are not getting bigger. LA cannot get bigger. San Francisco, all these big airports are locked in. There's communities around them. So you need to move more people in one smack. How do you do that? Well, you go from 180 Cs to 210. And that's just physics. So on the XLR is an interesting thing in as much as being a 321. It's great. Does it help to have that extra tank on it if you don't need it? Well, give an example. In the US, the average flight is 1,100 miles long. But the 737 and the 320neo all they can fly 3,000 miles. But you're only using a third of that range. Well, it doesn't matter, because you know what? In the end, you need to have that size 9 shoe that will fit extra routes if you need. So that if you need to go from Miami to Seattle or San Diego to Boston, which is corner to corner, you have that capability. So on the one hand, yes, the 321 XLR is a niche, but it's a niche inside the most in-demand model in the industry right now. So if they have to make it work, they'll make it work. So on the one hand, I think it's a niche in its origin, but in the net effect, after all said and done, it'll probably work either way because of where we are.
Before I move on to the next question, here's a little reminder to all of you listening to the podcast, but you haven't subscribed to it yet. Please do so now. Just press the follow or subscribe button, whichever podcast app you're using, and that should work. Thank you. Thomas, let's continue talking about the A321 XLR for now. IndiGo, of course, has started the Athens route with the aircraft, flying from both Mumbai and Delhi. This is a massive shift from their short-haul LCC routes. From your fleet data, does IndiGo's order for those 60 A350-900 suggest that they are preparing for a direct bloody war with Air India on the US and Europe routes? Or is this more about dominating the eastbound traffic to Australia and Japan and maybe Korea? Though admittedly, all those three routes are also served by Air India.
It will have to be a bit of both, because it's a significant number of aircraft that obviously is not going to come overnight. It's going to come in phases. But if you look at how IndiGo currently deploys their widebody aircraft that are wet leased in from Turkish Airlines and Norse, then they are not flying eastbound that much with the aircraft. I mean, they're flying Delhi to Bangkok, for example. But the vast majority is westbound into Europe and into the Turkish Airlines hub in Istanbul. So likely what you will see is that when these A350s come in, they will first start replacing these wet leased aircraft that are here, unless IndiGo looks at it from the perspective that they're just going to use them for growth and will keep the wet leased aircraft a bit longer where they can. I mean, there's always this question mark on how much longer they're allowed to do the Turkish Airlines wet lease into Istanbul. But if you look at all of the moves that IndiGo has made from a network growth perspective internationally so far, it has been a lot more westbound than eastbound. So the highly likely scenario is that these A350s are going to be flying more westbound than eastbound as well. I mean, you can see that as well if you look at all of the strategic alliances that have been announced with IndiGo teaming up with Air France, KLM, Virgin Atlantic, Delta. And so the more likely scenario is that there is going to be more capacity deployed westbound rather than eastbound. But obviously, with A350s and with the ambition of IndiGo to build the hub and spoke system internationally via the big Indian airports, you will have to deploy some of these aircraft eastbound as well. And to fly from Delhi to Tokyo or to Australia, New Zealand, and so on, you obviously need wide-body aircraft. With the XLRs, you can get as far as Manila or Jakarta and Bali and so on just fine. But you will need the A350s to fly further east. But the number of aircraft that you can deploy eastbound is just significantly smaller because of the number of viable markets that need so much capacity than you would have on the westbound market.
And US would be a very long shot for now, right? On 350-900s, or do you think they would eye the East Coast market?
I'm sure that is eventually one of the plans, but obviously, if you fly such long haul markets, you need to have significant feed for these markets. And IndiGo has a very significant feed domestically in India, but it would be better if they would have more international feed to top that up as well. So as they build up the network, as I said, the most likely scenario is that they're probably going to replace the wet leased aircraft that they have in the fleet right now to build up that feed, to build up the network in Europe that they fly right now with their own aircraft. And obviously there is going to be a shift because right now a lot of traffic is being routed with these very, very high density 777s flying into Istanbul. There will be a shift to more non-stop flying into the European market, but I'm pretty sure that this Istanbul and Turkish Airlines partnership is always going to be something that would be quite valuable to IndiGo because the number of points that you can connect to via the Istanbul hub in Europe is just massive from an Asian perspective. I mean, there is a joint venture between Thai Airways and Turkish Airlines as well that essentially has just been built for exactly that reason, to make sure that all of these secondary markets that are not viable to fly directly from Bangkok in their case are being served one stop in a joint venture setup because it's a lot better for Thai, it's a lot better for IndiGo if markets like Hamburg, Vienna, Lyon, there's a lot of secondary cities or smaller European capitals that are highly unlikely going to be able to take an A350-900 from Delhi, but you can reach all of them via Istanbul. So I assume that strategy is going to remain in place even when the A350s come.
Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg has stressed thoroughness over speed. In a market like India, where growth is the only metric that matters, and I would argue that you can say that for some other markets as well, can Boeing afford to be slow and thorough while Airbus ramps up to 75 aircraft a month by 2027?
Kelly Ortberg at Boeing has been absolutely right with that statement. If you think about the disruption to Boeing that the hiccups with the MAX and the 787 caused, you can see that the decision at Boeing to slow down last year and then come out slowly and then build with a solid base, instead of chasing the number, chasing the quality, was absolutely the right decision. If you can imagine, God forbid, that Boeing has another MAX problem or a 787 problem, what do you think the outcome will be? It'll be catastrophic. They cannot afford that. The fact is the backlog for Boeing is now close to 13 years. That backlog's not going to go anywhere. Comac is not a player. Embraer is not in that business. Christian Scherer told me a few years ago, their backlog was 10 years. Let's be very clear about this. Boeing is doing the right thing, focusing on quality. It's more important to get an airplane that will work consistently. Rick Durlow at Pratt & Whitney told me an interesting thing just before the air show last year. He said he was showing a bunch of us media people at their factory in Asheville, North Carolina, how they were making GTF parts and how they were taking these parts for the engine, and instead of using lasers to drill the holes in these parts, because they have to have holes to allow cool air to go through the engine inside, otherwise the parts will melt. It's so hot, and the pressure is so high. Pardon me. So they switched from laser cutting to water cutting, and they've added more holes. I said, well, doesn't that impact your fuel burn? He said, yes, it does. But instead of giving 20% better fuel burn, we'll go down a little bit. We're way over the 16% we promised. What is he saying? Customers will take a knock on fuel burn if they can get durability. Now, if you're the Pratt & Whitney GTF, that's clearly a big thing. Bottom line is, if you're living in the airline world right now, what do you want more than anything else? Reliable, reliable, reliable. You don't want your MAX arriving with a problem with quality control. You don't want anything to impact what you've sold. Remember, airlines can sell seats 360 days in advance, and they need to deliver on that promise. I mean, they've got their schedule. So again, I'm sorry to give you a long answer to a short question. Boeing is absolutely focusing on the right thing. And I bet you'll see that even though Airbus is going to try and shoot for 75, they'll do it very deliberately, very carefully. If you can imagine, I've used this example before when people talk about this. Imagine you are at Airbus and you are the conductor of an orchestra. The wind instruments are in Asia, the drums and those musical instruments are in Africa, and the violins are in South America, and you're conducting music. If these different instruments are not keeping time, you don't have music, you have noise. That's the worst nightmare for any of these OEMs, is noise. Everything has to work just in time. Rhythm. They have to keep the rhythm. So rate is a critical metric to watch. And if that metric is going to be impacted by quality, slow the music down, make sure that what you're delivering is going to be what your customer can put in the field right away, and it's going to just keep on going. That's what they need.
Great. Addison and Thomas, why don't we take a pause here and resume in the next episode in a couple of days? That brings us to the end of part 1 of this landmark 65th episode. We've covered some incredible ground today, from the LCCs to the A321XLR's role as a surgical hub buster to the fascinating premium evolution of carriers like IndiGo. Hearing Thomas and Addison break down why the pure LCC model is under such immense pressure really reframes how we should look at the Indian sky over the next few years. And in fact, not just Indian sky, the global sky. But we are only halfway through this amazing discussion. We move from the business model to diving deep into the engine crisis that is grounding fleets worldwide, the brutal market share war between Boeing and Airbus, and what lies ahead. Thomas and Addison, thank you for such brilliance. Again, to our listeners, you won't have to wait a full fortnight for the conclusion. Episode 66, the second part of this special conversation, will be released in just 3 days. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the finale of this heavyweight reunion. I'm Vishal Mehra, and this has been the Indian AvGeek. We'll see you in 3 days.